The chandelier above the dining hall sparkled like nothing was wrong. But at that table, something had been wrong for years. My mother-in-law didn't even look at me when she told me to leave the food on the sideboard, like I was staff. 12 wealthy guests watched. My husband Julian stared at his plate and said nothing. And that's when I calmly set the bowl down, looked her in the eye, and told her the truth. As of that afternoon, I owned the entire resort. So how did it come to this? The chandelier above the dining hall didn't just sparkle, it watched. Thousands of hand-cut crystals scattered light across the long mahogany table, throwing sharp reflections across the faces seated around it. Faces I had known for more than a decade. Faces that had shared meals with me, vacations with me, family, holidays with me. And yet, somehow, they had never really seen me. I stood at the edge of the table, holding a heavy ceramic salad bowl, my palms pressed into the cool glaze so tightly that my fingers had started to turn pale. The scent of roasted pine nuts and balsamic vinegar drifted upward, rich and expensive. But the only taste in my mouth was metal, that strange, bitter taste that comes from holding back words you've swallowed for far too long. At the head of the table, Beverly lifted her glass of vintage Chardonnay and studied the watch on the wrist of the guest beside her. A vintage piece. Something rare and ridiculous that probably cost more than most people's yearly salary. She admired it the way collectors admire trophies. I waited, not because I didn't know where the bowl belonged. I had set this table dozens of times before, but because a small part of me still believed naively that maybe tonight she would acknowledge me. Maybe she would look up. Maybe she would say my name like I belonged in the room. Instead, she flicked her manicured hand in my direction without even turning her head. The gesture was casual, dismissive, the kind of wave someone gives a server in a restaurant when they want water refilled. Just leave it on the sideboard, Elena. Her voice was smooth, practiced, dripping with the kind of polished cruelty that only comes from years of social climbing. And then the room went quiet. Silverware paused in midair. Conversations died halfway through sentences. 12 guests turned their heads toward me. Some watched with polite discomfort. Others with the bored indifference of people who had already decided what role you played in the room. Furniture, staff, background noise, anything but family. But the gaze that weighed the most was Julian's. My husband sat 3 seats down from Beverly, his shoulders slightly hunched, his eyes lowered toward his plate. For a moment, I waited for him to say something. Anything. He knew who I was. He had watched me manage infrastructure projects worth hundreds of millions of dollars. He had seen me lead teams of engineers who trusted me with decisions that affected entire cities. And yet here in this room, he studied a piece of asparagus like it was the most fascinating object in the world. He didn't speak, not a word. The silence stretched, heavy, thick, familiar. For 10 years, I had worn the same quiet mask in this family. The agreeable daughter-in-law, the one who smoothed over awkward moments, the one who kept the peace, the one who absorbed the small humiliations so dinners like this could keep running smoothly. But something about that moment felt different. Not louder, not explosive, just finished. My grip on the bowl relaxed. The room expected me to obey, to shuffle toward the sideboard like I always did. Instead, I stepped forward. The soft click of my heels against the limestone floor cut through the silence as I walked along the length of the table, past the guests, past the curious stares, past the carefully neutral expressions, all the way to the head of the table. Beverly finally looked up, not with concern, with irritation, as if the help had forgotten their place. I set the bowl down in front of her. The ceramic hit the polished wood with a sharp, deliberate sound. Not loud, but precise enough that the wine in her glass rippled. Then I met her eyes. For the first time in years, I didn't soften my expression. I didn't smile politely. I didn't lower my voice. I simply looked at her. "You're right, Beverly," I said. My voice surprised even me. Calm, clear, like ice touching glass. The help shouldn't eat with the guests. Around us, the guests shifted in their chairs. Confusion moved across their faces. But I wasn't finished. I let the words hang in the air for a moment. Long enough for the old version of me, the quiet one, to disappear completely. Then I continued, "But the owner should." The sentence landed like a dropped stone. Beverly blinked. Julian finally looked up, and I felt something inside my chest settle into place. "As of 4 o'clock this afternoon," I said softly, "I own this entire resort." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't gesture dramatically. I simply told the truth. Every stone, every bottle of wine, and the chair you're sitting in. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I didn't watch Beverly's face crumble or the way the wine glass might have slipped in her hand. I didn't stay to hear the sharp inhale from the guests or the whisper of confusion spreading down the table. I didn't need to. The truth had already landed. And once a truth like that lands, it doesn't need help making noise. So I turned. My heels clicked softly against the limestone floor as I walked toward the doors of the dining hall. The room behind me stayed frozen in that strange, suspended silence, like a photograph taken the moment before. Something breaks. Most people would have stayed. They would have demanded respect, raised their voices, thrown every buried frustration into the air like shattered glass. That's what people expect after humiliation. But I've spent my entire career inside complex systems, rail networks, infrastructure grids, digital control systems that move millions of people every day. And one thing you learn quickly in that world is this: you don't fix a derailment by shouting at the wreckage. You analyze the system. You isolate the fault. Then you reroute the power. Arguing with Beverly would have been like screaming at a broken signal light. Emotional, satisfying for a moment maybe, but completely useless. The real control was somewhere else, and I intended to take it. By the time the doors of the dining hall closed behind me, the noise of the estate had already faded. The marble corridors were quiet, lit by soft evening lamps that made the entire place feel hollow. For the first time that night, I took a slow breath, not from relief, from clarity. For years, I had tried to fix things inside that family the way people fix relationships, through patience, understanding, compromise. But families like the Vances didn't operate on emotion. They operated on hierarchy, control, access. And systems like that don't change because someone finally speaks up at dinner. They change when the structure underneath them shifts. Midnight found me in the estate library. The room was dark, except for the pale blue glow of my laptop screen. Outside the tall windows, the ocean had disappeared into the black horizon, and the estate grounds were silent. Inside the digital world, though, everything was wide open, clean, precise. My fingers moved across the keyboard almost automatically, the way they do when you've mapped a system in your head, long before you ever touch the controls. This wasn't revenge. It wasn't an emotional outburst. It was an audit. For years, I had quietly supported the machinery that kept the Vance family comfortable. Their access codes, their privileges, their invisible discounts and special treatment. They had treated me like background infrastructure, something useful but unimportant. But infrastructure has one interesting property. When it shuts down, everything else stops working too. I logged into the resort's central management portal, the digital nervous system that controlled everything, from guest privileges to security access. 6 months earlier, through a holding company no one in that family had ever heard of, I had acquired the debt that was slowly suffocating the resort. While Beverly had been busy planning charity galas and gossiping about social invitations, I had been signing the documents that made me her landlord. My watch buzzed softly on my wrist. I glanced down. 72 beats per minute. Steady. Controlled. Crying would have been easier. But tears are just wasted hydration when you're executing a corporate takeover. And tonight wasn't about emotion anymore. It was about architecture. By the time the estate finally went quiet, I was already in the library. The room had always been one of the few places in the house that felt honest. Dark oak shelves lined the walls, filled with books no one in the family had opened in years. The only light came from my laptop, casting a pale blue glow across the desk and the polished floor beneath it. Outside, the ocean pressed against the cliffs in slow, distant waves. Inside, everything was still. I opened the resort's central management system and watched the login screen appear. The interface looked simple, almost boring. A few menus, a handful of data fields. But beneath it was the digital nervous system of the entire property. Every guest profile, every security code, every reservation privilege and internal access point. For years, the Vance family believed they controlled this place. They walked through the halls like royalty, issuing instructions to staff, treating the resort like an inherited throne. What they never realized was that the throne had already changed hands. 6 months earlier, through a holding company with a deliberately forgettable name, I had quietly purchased the resort's outstanding debt. The Tidesbury had been bleeding money for years. Mismanagement, unpaid taxes, legacy discounts for Beverly's friends. The banks wanted out. I stepped in. While Beverly was busy hosting charity luncheons and discussing the proper temperature for champagne, I was sitting in conference rooms signing documents that transferred the leverage of the entire property. Technically, they had still been living here as if nothing had changed. But legally, they had been living on borrowed time. The dashboard loaded fully and the resort database opened in front of me. Names, room assignments, account privileges, hundreds of guest records arranged in neat digital rows. My fingers moved across the keyboard with the quiet familiarity of someone who builds systems for a living. This wasn't chaos, it was architecture. First, I located the Vance family profiles. There were several entries grouped together under permanent resident codes, an internal designation that granted them privileges far beyond those of normal guests. Complimentary spa services, private chef access, unlimited dining accounts, and the most ridiculous of all, a 100% legacy discount on the North Wing suites they had occupied for years. Free luxury housing inside a resort that was already drowning in debt. The irony would have been funny if it hadn't been so predictable. I highlighted the entire block of permissions. For a moment, the cursor blinked at the top of the screen. 10 years of quiet assumptions sat inside that file. One click erased them. The system processed the command instantly. Resident privileges revoked. Legacy discounts deleted. Permanent access codes terminated. Their profiles now looked exactly like what they actually were: unpaid guests. I leaned back slightly and took a slow breath, letting the quiet of the room settle again. No anger, no satisfaction, just order replacing disorder. Next came the facilities database. Beverly's favorite indulgence appeared quickly: the private beach cabana she treated like her personal throne. I remembered standing there once for nearly 3 hours, holding an umbrella over her, while she complained about the sun and the slow service. The entry sat in the system with a long list of reserved privileges attached to it. I opened the maintenance panel and changed the status. Out of service, structural integrity inspection required. Technically, it wasn't even a lie. The structure that supported the Vance family's authority had collapsed a long time ago. I was simply updating the paperwork. From there, I moved deeper into the system. Wi-Fi access credentials, gate authorization protocols, biometric security permissions for the North Wing. Each section opened one after another, like rooms inside a house I had finally decided to renovate. The Vance profiles disappeared from every list. Network access denied, security clearance revoked, master keycard privileges terminated. By the time the clock on my screen slipped past 2 in the morning, the estate's digital infrastructure no longer recognized their names. To the outside world, the building looked exactly the same. The chandeliers still glowed, the ocean still crashed below the cliffs. But beneath the surface, the entire system had quietly recalibrated. And by sunrise, when Beverly reached for her suite door, or tried to connect to the private network she loved to brag about, the resort would respond with something she had never heard here before: access denied. To the Vance family, I had always been something small, predictable, harmless. Mackenzie once called me the mouse. She didn't realize I heard it. One Christmas dinner, the baby monitor in the kitchen had accidentally picked up the conversation while they were laughing in the living room. Her voice came through the tiny speaker, casual and amused. "The mouse," she said. "Julian's quiet little wife with the sensible shoes." Everyone laughed. In their version of reality, I was the boring one. The woman who worked somewhere in tech. The one who slipped away early from dinners because she had projects and deadlines. They never asked what those projects were, and I never volunteered the explanation, because the truth would have sounded absurd to them. While Beverly was planning gala seating charts and arguing about which vineyard produced the most elegant Pinot, I was designing the control architecture for one of the largest high-speed rail corridors on the West Coast. 3 million passengers moved through that system every single day. Every signal, every safety protocol, every digital packet of information flowing between trains and track sensors ran through infrastructure that people like me built. My job wasn't glamorous. There were no champagne toasts, no designer gowns, just long meetings about structural loads, risk models, and systems that had to function perfectly. Because failure meant more than embarrassment. Failure meant cities grinding to a halt. The Vances lived in a world of appearances. I lived in a world of consequences. They measured success by the brands stitched into their clothing or the guest lists at their parties. The conversation at dinner revolved around watches, handbags, private clubs who had been invited to which charity event. Everything was symbolic, status layered on top of status. But engineering doesn't care about appearances. A bridge doesn't stay standing because someone important likes the design. A train doesn't move faster because a socialite approves of the color scheme. Either the structure holds or it collapses. That mindset shaped everything about how I lived. While Beverly invested her energy into maintaining the illusion of wealth, I invested quietly in things that produced real value. Land, equity, infrastructure funds. I didn't spend my quarterly bonuses on jewelry that sat in velvet boxes. I built an acquisition portfolio. Over the years, it grew into a $14 million investment fund that moved carefully through distressed properties and infrastructure assets. The Vances never noticed. They assumed my modest habits meant modest success. They mistook discipline for limitation. The irony was almost mathematical. While Beverly bragged about the price of her diamonds, she was secretly auctioning some of her designer bags online just to keep her credit cards from being declined. While Mackenzie curated the illusion of luxury for hundreds of thousands of followers, the influencer events she hosted inside the resort quietly drained the property's operating budget. Everything in their world was surface, shiny, fragile. My world was the opposite. Load-bearing walls, data networks, systems designed to survive pressure. And the difference between those two worlds explained something I had only recently begun to understand. They didn't disrespect me because they hated me. They dismissed me because they genuinely couldn't comprehend what I was building. To them, power looked like Beverly standing at the center of a ballroom, holding a glass of champagne, while people applauded her speeches. But real power rarely looks like that. Sometimes it looks like a quiet woman in practical shoes sitting behind a laptop, late at night, restructuring an entire system while no one else in the room even realizes the architecture has changed. By the time the Vances noticed what I had done, the foundation beneath them was already gone. For a long time, I believed I was investing in a family. Not financially, though. Looking back, that happened too, but emotionally. I believed in the quiet agreement that marriage is supposed to carry. You support each other, you protect each other, you fill the gaps when life stumbles. And for more than a decade, I did exactly that, just quietly. The Vance family had a remarkable talent for creating problems, and an equally remarkable blindness to how those problems kept disappearing. Take Mackenzie, for example. The year she decided to reinvent herself as a lifestyle influencer, she booked a brand-building retreat in Tulum, private villa, professional photographers, a full week of curated beach content designed to convince the internet she lived a life of effortless luxury. The problem was her credit card declined at check-in. I got the call from Julian while I was sitting in an airport lounge between meetings. He sounded embarrassed the way someone does when they're trying to protect a sibling from humiliation. So I opened my laptop, transferred the money, and covered the entire booking. Not because I cared about influencer retreats, but because I didn't want Mackenzie standing at that front desk with strangers watching her, pretend her life wasn't collapsing. No one ever mentioned it again. Not a thank you, not an acknowledgement, just silence, like the money had appeared out of thin air. Julian was more complicated. He had a habit, an expensive one, of collecting classic cars, beautiful machines, restored engines, polished chrome that gleamed under garage lights like museum pieces. But restoring old cars isn't cheap, and enthusiasm tends to outrun budgets. More than once, I noticed the quiet signs that his finances were slipping. Overdraft warnings, a loan payment pushed too far, the kind of details most people miss if they aren't paying attention. 3 times in a single year, I quietly topped off his emergency fund. Not large, dramatic gestures, just enough to stabilize things so Beverly wouldn't discover the gap and carve him apart at the dinner table. I told myself that was what partners did. You protect the person you love from unnecessary damage. And then there were the smaller things, the invisible repairs that kept the Vance family's world running smoothly. Plumbing problems in the estate that no one wanted to deal with. Maintenance bills for the North Wing suites that mysteriously never reached the resort's accounting office. Even the legacy discounts Beverly handed out to her social circle like party favors. I often ended up quietly covering the difference just to keep the property from bleeding money. None of it felt like sacrifice at the time. It felt like responsibility. I believed I was strengthening something that mattered, but sitting alone in the library that night, watching the financial records scroll across my screen, I finally saw the pattern clearly. Every time the family needed stability, I provided it. Every time something threatened their comfort, I absorbed it. They never asked how the system stayed running. They simply assumed it would. The truth settled over me, slowly, like a structural report confirming what the cracks in the walls had been warning about for years. They didn't value me. They valued the convenience of me. The quiet problem solver, the financial cushion, the emotional buffer who kept everything running smoothly without demanding recognition. In their story, I wasn't a partner or a daughter-in-law. I was infrastructure. And infrastructure only gets noticed when it stops working. That realization didn't make me angry. Not the explosive kind of anger people expect. It just made something inside me very clear. For 11 years, I had been the silent investor in their version of family, but the dividends had never arrived. And at some point, every investor has to decide whether to keep funding a failing system or shut the whole thing down. Julian was always the hardest part of the equation, not Beverly. Beverly was predictable. Her cruelty was loud, theatrical, almost structural. Once you understood how she operated control humiliation status, you could map her behavior like a machine. But Julian was quiet. And quiet variables are always harder to calculate. For years, I told myself he wasn't part of the problem. He didn't shout. He didn't insult me. He never raised his voice across the dinner table the way Beverly did. He just didn't intervene. At first, I interpreted that silence as conflict avoidance. Some people hate confrontation. Some people freeze when tension rises. But the longer I lived inside that family, the more I began to see the pattern behind his stillness. Julian hadn't simply grown up with a controlling mother. He had been shaped by her. Beverly didn't just dominate a room. She built psychological architecture around the people closest to her. Every act of independence from Julian had been treated like betrayal when he was younger. Every disagreement punished with guilt or humiliation. Over time, something subtle happens to a person raised inside that environment. They stop resisting, not because they agree, because resistance starts to feel pointless. Psychologists call it learned helplessness. When every attempt to change the outcome gets punished, eventually the mind adapts. It stops trying to escape the pattern. You sit still. You survive the moment. You wait for the storm to pass. Julian had been doing that his entire life. At the dinner table, while Beverly carved into me with those polished little remarks, I would glance at him sometimes. His shoulders would tighten. His jaw would set. He knew it was wrong. I could see that much. But the moment he looked toward his mother, something inside him would shut down. The same reflex he had probably learned as a child would take over. Stay quiet. Don't provoke her. Endure. From the outside, it looked like indifference. But I had begun to suspect it was something more like captivity. A cage built from fear, obligation, and guilt. And the cruelest part of that kind of cage is that the door is technically open. No lock. No chains. But the person inside has lived there so long, they forget the outside world exists. Julian was waiting for permission to be someone different. Permission to push back. Permission to protect his own marriage. But Beverly was never going to grant that permission. It would threaten the entire system she had built around herself. Sitting in the library that night, watching the resort servers update line by line, I realized something I had avoided admitting for years. Compassion had kept me there. I had stayed because I understood the trap Julian was in. But understanding a prison doesn't mean you have to live inside it. And the longer I stayed, the more I realized something else. Julian might never leave that cage. He might spend the rest of his life waiting for a freedom he had already been given. But I didn't have to wait with him. For a long time, I believed my role was to help him escape. That night, I finally understood something simpler. Sometimes the only way to survive a broken system is to step outside of it entirely. Morning arrived with that strange stillness that comes after a storm. The kind where the air feels heavy like the house itself is holding its breath. I was standing in the kitchen pouring myself a cup of black coffee when I heard the familiar rhythm of heels on tile. Sharp, confident, performative. Mackenzie? She swept into the room like she owned it, and the first thing I noticed wasn't her expression. It was the small ring light clipped to her phone and the gimbal stabilizer in her hand. Of course, in Mackenzie's world, nothing existed unless it was content. She didn't ask how I was feeling after the dinner. She didn't acknowledge what I had said. The night before, the words that had frozen the entire dining hall. Instead, she tilted the camera toward me as if I were an exhibit. And here we have the assistant in her natural habitat. She chirped brightly into the lens. Her voice had shifted into that exaggerated influencer tone, half amusement, half performance, for the audience watching through the screen. I stood at the sink rinsing my mug slowly. Behind me, I could see her reflection in the polished chrome of the espresso machine. POV. She continued smiling at her phone. When your brother's wife has one too many mimosas and suddenly thinks she owns the entire resort. She laughed lightly like the punchline was obvious. Isn't she precious, so dedicated to the aesthetic of service? The comment floated through the kitchen like a carefully placed trap. This was how the Vance family operated when reality threatened them. They didn't confront it. They diluted it with performance jokes narratives that made the truth look ridiculous. Mockery was easier than acknowledgement. My phone buzzed softly in my pocket. I pulled it out and saw the Vance family group chat lighting up. Beverly had pinned a message to the top. I opened it. Regarding Elena's unfortunate outburst last night, it read, "We believe the altitude and the stress from her little work project may have caused a temporary mental episode." My eyes moved slowly across the screen. Please treat her with the gentle patience she deserves. There it was. Not denial, reframing. With a single paragraph, Beverly had taken something factual ownership. Documents, legal transfers, financial control, and transformed it into a psychological problem. In her version of reality, I wasn't the owner of the resort. I was unstable, delusional, someone who needed to be humored. The message continued. Julian and I have decided to overlook the situation for the sake of the family gala tonight. Overlook. Like my words had been a spilled drink at dinner. I looked up again at Mackenzie's reflection in the chrome machine. She was still filming, still smiling completely, convinced she was directing the narrative. To her followers, this clip would look like harmless family teasing. A slightly dramatic sister-in-law. Nothing more. But beneath the surface, the strategy was obvious. If you can't control the truth, you control the story. I took a slow sip of my coffee, letting the warmth settle in my chest. Anger would have been easy in that moment, but anger burns fast. What I needed now was something colder, something far more sustainable than outrage. Because while Mackenzie filmed her little performance and Beverly rewrote reality in group chats, the system underneath them had already changed. A few minutes after the kitchen scene, my phone buzzed again. Not the family group chat this time. A different notification, encrypted, short and direct. Management files prepped. Legal team is on standby at the gate. We're ready when you are, boss. Ethan. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and walked toward the far end of the estate, where the resort's management offices sat quietly. Behind glass and dark oak walls, it was a completely different world from the glittering guest wings. Less spectacle, more reality. Ethan was already waiting when I stepped inside. He didn't greet me with the overly cheerful smile managers usually use around guests. Instead, he simply reached across the desk and pushed a thick leather binder toward me. The holding company is officially the sole owner, Elena, he said calmly. The deed cleared yesterday at 4:02 p.m. 4 o'clock, almost exactly the moment I had spoken in the dining hall. I opened the binder slowly. Inside were the documents that turned speculation into fact. Property transfer records, debt acquisition agreements, title confirmations stamped with government seals. Clean, legal, irreversible. For years, the Vance family had treated the North Wing like their personal estate inside the resort. Permanent suites, unlimited services, no invoices, no real accounting. The audit reports laid out the damage in black and white. Maintenance fees collected from Beverly's wealthy friends for exclusive access. Money that had never entered the resort's accounts. Grand ballroom events Mackenzie had hosted. For influencers' lavish parties that cost the resort over $11,000 in labor and catering. All billed to accounts that didn't exist. The financial pattern was unmistakable, a parasite-host relationship. I turned another page, and that's when the situation shifted from embarrassing to dangerous. Ethan slid a separate folder across the desk. Vance Family Trust, he said quietly. Inside were withdrawal records from the family trust accounts. At first glance, they looked routine. Transfers labeled as consulting payments, property stabilization expenses, administrative costs. But the deeper forensic audit told a different story. 6 months after Beverly's husband had been buried, a large withdrawal had been approved from the Tax Stabilization Reserve. $900,000. Money specifically allocated to ensure the resort's property taxes could never fall behind. The authorization signature at the bottom of the form stopped me cold. Her husband's name, signed months after his death. I studied the pen strokes carefully. Jagged, forced. Not the fluid signature pattern repeated on older documents. She forged it, I said quietly. Ethan nodded once. And routed the funds through the resort's operational accounts, he added. Shell consulting firms, fake service invoices. It kept the withdrawals from attracting attention. Tax reserves drained, resort funds used to hide the trail, which meant something far worse than family drama. Federal tax evasion. And when I flipped to the final authorization page, my chest tightened slightly. A second digital signature sat beneath Beverly's. Julian's, whether he understood the documents or simply clicked approve because his mother told him to. His name was attached to the transaction trail. I closed the folder slowly. The room felt heavier now. They're not just losing their rooms, I said. My voice steadied despite the weight of the realization. Ethan waited. This isn't a family dispute anymore, I continued. I looked down at the forged signature one last time. It's a criminal investigation. By the time evening arrived, the resort looked exactly the way Beverly liked it. The ballroom glowed with silk tablecloths, crystal glasses, and the soft shimmer of chandeliers reflecting off polished marble. Waiters moved between guests with trays of champagne, the room buzzing with the low, admiring laughter of people who believed they were attending the social event of the season, the Vance Gala. Beverly stood at the center of it all, exactly where she always placed herself on the small raised dais near the stage. Her posture was flawless, her diamonds catching the light as she lifted her glass high above the crowd. To heritage, she declared warmly, her voice echoing across the vaulted ceiling. The room quieted instantly. To the Vance legacy, she continued, smiling as the guests leaned in to listen. A legacy that stands as strong as the cliffs beneath this beautiful resort. A ripple of applause spread through the ballroom. People nodded politely, some lifting their own glasses in admiration. They didn't know the wine in their hands had been purchased with money pulled from forged accounts. They didn't know the cliffs beneath them were already crumbling. I stepped forward before the applause could finish. The sound of my heels against the marble floor cut through the room just enough to draw attention. Heads turned slowly as I moved toward the dais, and I could feel the shift almost immediately. They expected the same Elena they had seen for years, the quiet one, the one who wore simple dresses and stayed politely in the background. But tonight I wasn't wearing the navy dress Beverly liked to call my mouse uniform. I had changed. The charcoal silk suit fit perfectly tailored and sharp, the kind of outfit worn by someone who signs contracts, not someone who clears dinner plates. Beverly noticed the difference the moment I stepped onto the dais beside her. Her smile stayed frozen for the guests, but her eyes hardened. "Elena, dear," she murmured through her teeth, still holding her glass aloft. "You've had your little moment of drama. Sit down before you embarrass Julian further. We're in the middle of a toast." I didn't sit. Instead, I reached for the microphone resting on the stand. The brief screech of feedback sliced through the room, silencing the last few conversations. Dozens of faces turned toward me. "The Vance legacy isn't standing on cliffs," I said calmly, letting the microphone carry my voice through the ballroom. Beverly's smile finally faltered. "It's standing on $900,000 of forged signatures," I continued, "and more than $100,000 in unpaid property taxes." The room froze. A few guests shifted uncomfortably. Others leaned forward. "And unfortunately," I added, "I paid those taxes this morning." I pulled a folder from the portfolio tucked under my arm and handed the top document to Beverly. Her fingers trembled slightly as she scanned the page. "What is this nonsense?" she hissed. "That I said, making sure every word carried through the microphone is your eviction notice." Gasps rippled through the crowd. "And those documents behind it," I continued, "are the wire transfer records showing how tax reserve funds were moved through this resort's operational accounts." I paused just long enough for the words to settle. "Accounts that now belong to me." Julian stepped forward from the edge of the crowd, his face pale. "Elena, stop," he said quietly, panic threading through his voice. "This is private. We can talk about this later." I looked at him for a moment. 10 years of silence sat between us. "We're done talking, Julian." The microphone caught the softness of the words anyway. "You spent a decade watching me clear the plates," I added. "Now you can watch me clear the house." Behind him, Mackenzie's phone slipped from her hand and clattered against the marble floor, the live stream screen finally going dark. As the reality of the moment sank in around the room, The admiration that had once surrounded Beverly dissolved into something else. Shock, whispers, and the slow, brutal collapse of a carefully constructed reputation. The ballroom stayed silent for a long moment. You could almost hear the weight of the room shifting like a structure realizing the foundation underneath it had cracked. I glanced toward the back of the hall where the security team now stood, quietly along the wall. They had been there for several minutes waiting. Everything was already in motion. I returned my attention to the microphone. "The Vance family lease for the North Wing Suites is terminated," I said evenly. "Effective immediately." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Guests turned toward Beverly, toward Julian, toward Mackenzie, watching the slow collapse of a social hierarchy they had assumed was permanent. "Security is currently stationed outside the North Wing," I continued. "You have 30 minutes to collect your personal belongings." Mackenzie let out a sharp, disbelieving laugh that quickly dissolved into panic. Beverly didn't laugh. She scanned the room instead, looking at the same people who had applauded her moments ago. Her peers, her admirers. Now they were looking back at her differently, not with respect, with distance. "With the exception of personal items," I added calmly. "Everything else in those suites, furniture, art, and property belongs to the estate and will be retained or auctioned to offset the outstanding debt." The words landed quietly, but they carried. Julian stood frozen, his face drained of color. Beverly tried to hold her posture, but the authority she had worn like a crown was already slipping. I stepped away from the microphone. 30 minutes, Beverly, I said softly as I passed her. Then I leaned slightly closer, so only she could hear the final words. "The help doesn't wait," and this time neither did I. I walked through the crowd as it parted in silence. For the first time in years, I wasn't shrinking to fit the room. I was leaving it. The resort is quiet now. The constant noise of demands and entitlement has faded, replaced by the sound of the ocean and the wind along the cliffs. The North Wing is being rebuilt, not as a private playground, but as a creative residency for young architects and engineers who actually build things. Sometimes reclaiming your life isn't loud. It's simply restoring balance. If this story resonated with you, feel free to subscribe for more stories like this. And tell me in the comments, what would you have done in my place?